It was a warm afternoon in a small town nestled somewhere between winding roads and endless fields. The town had always had a sense of peacefulness to it, an unspoken rule that everyone knew their place, and there were boundaries that should never be crossed. But for Gregory Owens, that afternoon would be anything but ordinary. Gregory had lived in the town all his life. He wasn't a loud man, nor did he seek attention. He was the type of person who kept his head down and worked hard, but deep inside he had dreams, big dreams. Gregory knew that his life was about to change when he was elected as the new mayor of the town. It had been a long, tough campaign, and he'd fought every step of the way, but in the end, the people had chosen him. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for his entire community, a victory for those who felt overlooked and unheard for far too long. And now, today, he was heading to City Hall for his first meeting as mayor. On this particular day, however, as he drove through the town, Gregory had no idea that things were about to take an unexpected and, frankly, shocking turn. He was just an ordinary man in a regular car, heading to what should have been an exciting new chapter in his life. But that's not what was going to happen. The reality of small-town life had a way of trapping people into their own assumptions and biases, and it was about to reveal itself to Gregory in the worst way possible. As he drove along the town's main road, he noticed a familiar pair of police cars parked just a few feet ahead. The cars were nothing special, a couple of old patrol vehicles that had seen better days. But what struck him was how the officers in them were standing idly by, not really doing anything at all. It was a small town, and the cops were known to be more relaxed, sometimes too relaxed, in fact. But Gregory never thought much of it. He had no reason to think they would take an interest in him. But as he passed the patrol cars, one of the officers, a man Gregory recognized from high school, suddenly waved his hand, signaling him to pull over. Surprised, but not too concerned, Gregory complied, slowing his car and pulling to the side of the road. The officer approached, his steps heavy with an air of authority, but there was something in his posture that made Gregory uneasy. "Hey, Gregory," the officer said, looking at him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We need to check your vehicle. Got any idea why we pulled you over?" Gregory wasn't sure what to say. He had been driving with no issues and hadn't broken any traffic laws. He hadn't been speeding, and there were no signs that anything was wrong with his car. But still, the officer's words made him nervous. Maybe it was just a routine stop. He hadn't been pulled over in years, and this one felt different. Something wasn't right, but Gregory didn't know what. No. I wasn't speeding or anything," Gregory replied, his voice steady but cautious. The officer took a long look at Gregory, almost sizing him up. "Yeah, well, it's just a little check. Go ahead and step out of the vehicle," he said in a flat tone. Gregory did as instructed, stepping out of his car, trying to remain calm. Another officer who was leaning against the second patrol car walked over to join them. This officer looked more relaxed, almost like he didn't really care about the whole situation. Still, Gregory couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The officer who had stopped him began to ask him a series of questions. Nothing too personal, just small talk about where he was headed and why. Gregory felt like it was a strange series of questions, but he answered politely, not wanting to stir up trouble. After all, he had nothing to hide. "So, you headed somewhere important today, Gregory?" the first officer asked, his tone almost mocking. "Yeah," Gregory replied. "I've got a meeting at City Hall. I'm the new mayor." He smiled slightly, hoping that mentioning his new position would ease the situation. The officers didn't respond immediately, and Gregory could feel the shift in the air. He noticed how their smiles faded slightly, and the way they exchanged glances. There was something in the way they looked at him that made him uncomfortable. He had always been treated with respect around here, even by people who didn't know him well. But now it was different. He could feel their judgment in the air, their subtle disbelief. "Mayor, huh?" one of the officers said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, look at that, the new big shot in town." Gregory's smile faded. What was supposed to be a friendly exchange suddenly felt far less welcoming. The officer's tone had shifted to something cold and dismissive, And Gregory didn't understand why. He had always tried to be a part of his community, to give back, and now he was being treated like a joke. Still, Gregory kept his cool, not wanting to escalate the situation. "Yes, that's right. I'm heading to my first meeting." The officers didn't seem interested in hearing more. Instead, they started to ask about his car and whether he had anything illegal inside, though they didn't seem genuinely concerned. It felt more like a show, a power move, and one that Gregory wasn't sure how to handle. One of the officers began to glance around Gregory's car, clearly looking for something to pick at. He rummaged through his things in the trunk, throwing papers and personal items around carelessly. "What's all this stuff? You got something to hide?" Gregory watched in disbelief as the officer carelessly flipped through his belongings, not finding anything out of the ordinary. His stomach tightened and he felt a wave of frustration wash over him. What had started as a simple check had now turned into something deeper, more sinister. The way they were treating him was beginning to feel more personal. But then, something happened that Gregory never could have predicted. One of the officers, without warning, grabbed the stack of documents from his back seat and started flipping through them. Gregory's heart sank as he realized what it was, the documents he had worked tirelessly on for his new role as mayor. Papers that had taken months of planning, meetings, and paperwork. His hopes and dreams for this new chapter in his life were neatly packed into that folder. "Let's see what we got here," the officer muttered, not looking at Gregory, still flicking through the documents with a careless hand. And then, just as quickly, the officer lit a match and set the documents on fire. Gregory's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced in disbelief as he watched the flames eat away at the very papers that held his future. The officers laughed, not realizing what they had just done. They were too busy joking, too consumed by their own misguided sense of humor. Gregory's heart pounded in his chest. He stood there stunned as the flames flickered in the breeze. His dreams were burning before his eyes. But what they didn't know, what they could never have known, was that the man they just humiliated was not just any ordinary person. He was the new mayor of this town, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Gregory stood frozen, his mind racing as he watched the officer casually burn the stack of papers. The flames crackled and danced in the wind, slowly reducing his hard work, his future, and his dreams to nothing but ashes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could they do this? How could they just destroy everything so carelessly without any thought to what those papers represented? The officers, however, seemed completely unaware of the gravity of what they had just done. They were laughing, joking about the fire, as if it were nothing more than some petty prank. One officer elbowed the other as they exchanged smirks and snickers. "Look at that," the first officer said. "Guess that's what happens when you try to act all important. We'll teach him a lesson." Gregory's heart sank. Those papers weren't just any documents. They were the foundation of his new role as mayor. They were filled with plans for the future, the policies he intended to implement, and the promises he had made to the community. To these officers, it was just a stack of paper, but to him, it was his future, his commitment to change. And yet they were treating it like a joke. He could feel the heat from the flames on his face, but it wasn't the fire that burned him. It was the sting of humiliation and the sense of powerlessness. He was a man who had worked his entire life to earn the respect of his community, and now here he was standing in front of two police officers, having his dreams destroyed in a matter of seconds. Gregory wanted to say something, shout at them, demand they stop, maybe even try to save the burning documents. But the words wouldn't come. It was like the air had been sucked out of his lungs, and all he could do was watch as his efforts turned to smoke. Finally, the fire began to die down. The papers were nothing but charred remnants, slowly turning to ash. The officers, satisfied with their prank, turned their attention back to Gregory. They didn't seem to care that they had just destroyed a piece of his future. They were too busy relishing in their cruel joke. "Well, that was fun," the second officer said with a chuckle. "Looks like we showed him who's boss around here." Gregory felt a surge of anger, but he couldn't express it. The last thing he wanted was to make the situation worse. He didn't know who these officers were trying to prove something to, but it was clear that they saw him as just another target for their ridicule, and it hurt. It hurt in a way that no physical wound could ever match. They had stripped away his dignity, and they didn't even realize it. "Is that it?" Gregory finally asked, his voice low and controlled. He was trying to hold on to his composure, trying not to let his emotions get the best of him. But inside, a storm was brewing. The officers exchanged amused glances, as though they were getting some kind of satisfaction from the discomfort they were causing. "Yeah," the first officer said with a dismissive wave. "You can go now, but maybe next time keep a lower profile, huh?" Gregory didn't say another word. He was too stunned to speak. The words they had thrown at him, the way they had torn apart something so important to him, still echoed in his mind. He turned away from them, slowly walking back to his car, his legs feeling heavy. He wanted to get out of there. He wanted to leave this nightmare behind him and pretend like it had never happened. But deep down, he knew he could never forget it. This wasn't just some small-town misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something that cut to the core of who he was and what he stood for. As he got into his car, the reality of the situation began to settle in. He glanced at the dashboard and saw the small, crumpled remains of what had once been his future. His papers were gone, and there was nothing he could do to get them back. He was now standing at a crossroads, unsure of what his next steps should be, yet knowing he couldn't let this go unchallenged. Gregory knew he had to do something. But what? The officers had made their point. They had humiliated him, destroyed his work, and made him feel small. But he refused to be broken by them. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't understand the strength that lay inside him, the strength that had carried him through years of hardship and struggle to get where he was. And now, he was going to use that strength to make sure this never happened again. But first, he had to get to City Hall. There was no turning back now. He was the mayor, and no matter what these officers had done, no matter how they tried to make him feel powerless, he had a duty to the people who had voted for him. He had promised them change, and he wasn't going to let a few racist cops take that away from him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. The drive to City Hall felt longer than it ever had before. His mind was filled with thoughts of what had just happened, of the injustice he had endured. But there was also a flicker of something else, something stronger than anger. It was determination. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He was going to rise above it and show everyone, including the officers who had tried to tear him down, that they had underestimated him. By the time Gregory arrived at City Hall, he was no longer just the man they had tried to humiliate. He was the mayor. He was in charge now, and that meant he had a responsibility to the people who had placed their trust in him. The officers' actions were no longer just a personal attack. They were an attack on the very community he was now leading. Gregory stepped out of his car and made his way to the front door of City Hall. As he walked, he could hear the faint chatter of people inside. His mind was still buzzing with everything that had just happened, but he knew he had to focus. He had a meeting to attend. The work of a mayor was waiting for him, and nothing at all, was going to stop him from fulfilling his duties. Not the officers, not their cruel joke, and certainly not the injustice that they had tried to force upon him. As he entered the building, he took one last look behind him, knowing that the moment he stepped inside, everything would change. He was no longer just Gregory Owens, the man they had tried to break. He was the new mayor, and he was ready to take on whatever came next. Gregory walked through the doors of City Hall, the familiar sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The building was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were waiting for something. Maybe it was waiting for him to take the first step into his new role. He could feel the weight of the room, the weight of the building, the weight of his new position pressing on him, but there was something else, something far stronger than any of that. The anger and frustration from what had just happened outside still burned inside him, but he pushed it down, knowing that he couldn't let it control him. Not now. Not when everything was about to change. He had worked too hard for this moment, for this chance to make a difference in his town, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially two ignorant officers, take that away from him. As Gregory moved through the hall, he passed by the old portraits of past mayors lining the walls. Some faces were stern, some smiled faintly, but all of them held the weight of years of leadership. He paused for a brief moment, taking in the faces of those who had come before him, and then he took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. His name would soon be added to that list. The swearing-in ceremony was scheduled to begin soon, and a crowd was starting to gather in the main chamber. Gregory could hear their voices, a mix of excitement and nervousness, all whispers of what was to come. He couldn't help but feel a little nervous himself. It wasn't just the ceremony, it was everything that had led up to this moment, and everything that would follow. It wasn't just about cutting ribbons and giving speeches. It was about real change, real leadership, and right now, it felt like the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. But before he could get too lost in his thoughts, one of his closest friends, Carla, approached him with a big smile. Carla had been with him through the hardest parts of his campaign, and she knew just how much this meant to him. She had been a source of strength, offering support when Gregory doubted himself. "Gregory," Carla said, her voice full of warmth and excitement. "You made it. This is really happening." Gregory smiled, though it was a tight smile. He wanted to be happy. He wanted to feel that joy. But the memory of what had happened earlier outside the town had cast a shadow over everything. "I did make it," Gregory replied, trying to keep his voice steady, "but I'm not sure how to feel about it all yet." Carla raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing the unease in his tone. "What's going on? Something's bothering you. Talk to me." Gregory hesitated for a moment. He wanted to share what had happened with her, to let her know about the officers and the way they had treated him, but he wasn't sure how to explain it. He didn't want to distract from the ceremony or the moment, but the weight of what had happened was too much to ignore. It had shaken him to the core. I was stopped by two officers earlier today." He began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They mocked me, Carla. They humiliated me. And then they burned the documents I was carrying." Carla's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? They did what?" Gregory nodded. "They didn't know who I was. They didn't realize I was the new mayor. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what they did to me, to my work. They destroyed everything I've worked for." Carla stood there for a moment, her face a mix of shock and anger. It was hard to believe, hard to wrap her head around the fact that someone, especially law enforcement officers, would act so recklessly, so cruelly. But she knew Gregory. She knew his character. She knew how much this meant to him, and she wasn't going to let anyone tear that down. "That's unbelievable," she said quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "But you're going to show them. You're going to show everyone that they can't break you. You've come so far already, and now you're about to take charge. You're a leader, Gregory. That's what they need to understand." Gregory felt a surge of appreciation for her words. He had always known that Carla had his back, but hearing her speak so strongly, so confidently, gave him the strength he needed. He could still feel the sting of the officer's actions, but now it was mixed with something else, a renewed sense of purpose. He had to move forward. He had to keep going. For himself. For his community. "Thanks, Carla," Gregory said, his voice a little firmer now. "I needed to hear that." "Of course," she replied, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Now let's get you ready for this ceremony. The town is waiting for you, Mayor Owens." For the first time since the incident with the officers, Gregory felt a little lighter. He wasn't going to let what had happened outside control him. He had worked too hard for this moment. This was bigger than them. This was bigger than anyone who tried to put him down. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to be broken. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. As Gregory stood at the front of the room taking the oath of office, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. There were nervous smiles, hopeful glances, and some skeptical stares. It was clear that not everyone was entirely sure what to expect from their new mayor. But Gregory was determined to show them that he was there to make a real difference. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was going to be a leader. As the ceremony continued, Gregory's thoughts wandered briefly, back to what had happened earlier with the officers. He could still picture the flames, the way the papers burned away like they were nothing. But it was also in that moment that he realized something important. He wasn't just Gregory Owens anymore. He was the new mayor. And his job was to lead, with integrity, to bring about change, and to stand up for what was right, even when it felt like the world was against him. When the ceremony ended, the applause was loud, but Gregory wasn't thinking about the clapping or the cheers. He was thinking about the work ahead, about the challenges he would face as he tried to navigate the politics of the town and make real change. But most of all, he was thinking about how he was going to stand tall in the face of everything that had happened to him. He was going to prove to those officers and to everyone else that he was more than they could ever imagine. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Gregory was introduced to various members of the town council, and he gave a short speech about his vision for the future. He tried to focus on the positives, on the opportunities that lay ahead, but even as he spoke about unity and change, he couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't quite right. The officers, who had mocked him and humiliated him, were still out there somewhere, still operating in the same small town that he was now in charge of, and that wasn't something he could ignore. But for now, Gregory knew he had to focus. His work as mayor had just begun, and he had a long road ahead of him. There were people to meet, policies to put in place, and changes to be made. But most of all, he was determined to prove that nothing, absolutely nothing, could break him. Not even the officers who had tried to crush his spirit. The following days after the ceremony were filled with a mixture of excitement and tension for Gregory. Now that he was officially the mayor, he had a responsibility to not only lead, but to restore faith in a community that had been long divided. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the future and his new role, the incident with the two officers lingered in his mind, a shadow that refused to fade away. It wasn't just the humiliation that troubled Gregory. It was the fact that those officers, who were supposed to protect and serve, had behaved in such a reckless and unprofessional way. They had disrespected him, sure, but more importantly, they had disrespected everything he was trying to build, for the town. They had shown a blatant disregard for justice, for fairness, and for the people they were sworn to protect. Gregory knew he had to act. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't let these officers think that their behavior was acceptable, that they could continue to wield their power without consequence. He had to take a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone in the town who had ever felt overlooked, mistreated, or unheard. With a newfound sense of purpose, Gregory began to address the issue head-on. He reached out to the local news station, asking for a private meeting. He knew that shining a light on the incident was the only way to ensure that it didn't fade into the background. The community needed to know what had happened and, more importantly, how it was going to be handled. Gregory was determined to make sure that no one in the town ever had to face what he had faced on that fateful afternoon. The meeting with the news station was set for the following day. Gregory spent the night preparing his statement, trying to find the right words that would not only explain the situation but also inspire change. He knew that what he said in that meeting could set the tone for his entire tenure as mayor. This was his chance to show the people of the town who he really was and what he stood for. The day of the meeting arrived, and Gregory stood before the cameras, his heart pounding in his chest. Carla stood beside him for support, her calm presence giving him the strength to speak. The reporter, a woman named Sarah, greeted them with a firm handshake and a smile. There was a sense of professionalism about her, but Gregory could tell that even she was unsure about what was coming next. After all, small towns like this rarely made the news for controversial reasons. "Mayor Owens, thank you for taking the time to meet with us today," Sarah began, her voice steady but warm. "We understand you have something important to share, regarding an incident that occurred last week. Could you tell us what happened?" Gregory cleared his throat, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "Yes, thank you, Sarah. What happened last week was something I never expected, especially not in our town. As some of you may know, I was stopped by 2 police officers while on my way to a meeting. They questioned me, mocked me, and, in the end, destroyed important documents that I was carrying, documents that were crucial for my new role as mayor. Sarah nodded, her expression serious. We understand that this must have been difficult for you, but can you tell us, what is it that you plan to do about it? Gregory looked directly into the camera, his voice calm, but filled with determination. I'm not here to play games, and I'm not here to sweep this under the rug. What happened was wrong. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and it was a clear example of how not to serve a community. We need to address this. We need to make sure that every officer in this town understands that their actions have consequences. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle. I am demanding a full investigation into what happened. These officers need to be held accountable for their actions, and I will be working with the town council to ensure that we put in place stronger oversight and more comprehensive training for our law enforcement. Our town deserves better. The room was silent for a few seconds. Sarah seemed taken aback, but she quickly recovered. You're saying that these officers could potentially face serious consequences for their actions? Gregory nodded. Absolutely. What they did was not just a mistake, it was an abuse of power, and it's my responsibility to ensure that this kind of behavior is not tolerated in any form. The people of this town deserve to feel safe and respected, and that starts with holding those who are supposed to protect them accountable. Sarah looked at him for a moment as though weighing his words. And what kind of reaction have you received from the community so far? Gregory's expression softened. I've heard from a lot of people. There's been a lot of support, especially from those who have felt silenced in the past. They're glad to see someone standing up for what's right. But there are also some who are skeptical, people who are afraid of change, afraid of upsetting the status quo. But this town needs to change. We need to move forward, not backwards. Sarah nodded, clearly impressed with his resolve. It sounds like you have a plan. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the people of this town? Gregory took a deep breath. Yes, I want to say that this is just the beginning. I'm here to serve every person in this community, every race, every background, every belief. We are stronger when we stand together, and we have the power to make this town a place where everyone feels welcome, valued, and heard. I will do everything in my power to ensure that happens. The interview ended soon after, and Gregory felt a mix of relief and anticipation. He had said what needed to be said. Now it was out there, and there was no going back. The town knew where he stood, and he had no intentions of backing down. The aftermath of the interview was exactly what Gregory had hoped for. The story made headlines, and the people of the town began talking. The issue with the officers became a point of discussion, not just within the local government but in homes and businesses across the community. Some were outraged, others were supportive, but what mattered most was that people were paying attention. The conversation had started, and it was one that needed to happen. Days later, the town council convened for an emergency meeting. Gregory stood at the front of the room, addressing the members with the same calm determination that he had shown during his interview. We need to take immediate action, he said, his voice steady. This town is at a crossroads. We cannot afford to let incidents like the one I experienced last week slide by. We have to be proactive. We have to set a standard that respects all people, regardless of their race or background. The council members listened attentively, some nodding in agreement, others remaining quiet. But the message was clear. The town was changing, and Gregory was leading the charge. As the meeting continued, Gregory knew that it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, there would be pushback from those who didn't want things to change. But he was ready. He had made a promise to the people, and he wasn't going to break it. He was going to make sure that his town became a place where justice, fairness, and respect were not just words but the foundation of everything. The days following Gregory's powerful interview were filled with a whirlwind of activity. His phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, residents, and even local businesses. People were starting to take notice, not only of what had happened, but also of Gregory's determination to make things right. Some were excited by his bold stance, while others were skeptical. Still, everyone had an opinion. and the town was buzzing with the latest developments. Gregory had expected resistance. He knew that any kind of change, especially one that challenged the long-standing ways of the town, would face opposition. But what surprised him was how quickly things were starting to shift. A growing number of people were voicing their support for him. They had seen the injustice and were eager to see action taken. It was clear that the town was ready for something new, something different. But for Gregory, the journey had only just begun. As mayor, he had to balance the excitement and the challenges of his new role. There were town meetings to attend, policies to review, and decisions to make. And in the midst of all this, he still had the issue of the officers to handle. The town council met again, this time to discuss the investigation into the officers' actions. The room was filled with tension as Gregory stood at the front, presenting the facts as clearly as he could. The officers had been put on paid leave while the investigation was underway, and he was determined to make sure they were held accountable for what they had done. It wasn't just about those two officers anymore. Gregory knew that the entire system needed to be looked at. He wasn't going to stop at a single incident. He was going to push for real change. He knew that real reform couldn't happen unless the entire law enforcement system in the town was reevaluated. He was ready to take on that challenge, even if it meant facing even more pushback. During the council meeting, he listened as the other members discussed the matter. Some agreed with him, others hesitated, but all of them knew that Gregory was right. They knew that the town could no longer afford to ignore what had happened. They had to act, and they had to act fast. One council member, a woman named Elaine, spoke up. "Gregory, I think you're asking us to do something that will take a lot of work, and a lot of people aren't going to be happy about it. Some of our residents believe that the police department is already doing enough. They're worried about pushing things too far." Gregory nodded, understanding the concern. "I get that," he said. "But we can't just look the other way when something like this happens. We can't pretend that it didn't affect the community. People are watching us. People want to see us do the right thing. And if we don't, if we let these officers off the hook, we'll be telling everyone that this behavior is acceptable. And that's not the kind of town I want to be a part of. We need to show that we value justice, and we value all the people in this town." There was a long silence in the room, and then Elaine spoke again, her voice quieter but firm. "You're right. We can't let this go. I think we need to move forward with a full investigation. But we also need to consider what we can do to prevent this kind of thing from happening again in the future." Gregory's eyes lit up. "Exactly. We need training programs, community outreach, and stronger oversight. It's not just about punishing the officers involved. It's about changing the culture. We need to make sure that everyone in this town, officers, residents, everyone, understands that this behavior won't be tolerated." The council members nodded, slowly but surely coming to a consensus. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but they were all starting to see the bigger picture. Gregory wasn't just asking them to punish two officers. He was asking them to change the system, to make sure that no one would have to face what he had faced. After the meeting, the momentum continued to build. News of the investigation spread, and the town became a topic of discussion in the local and even state media. People from neighboring towns reached out to Gregory, offering support and sharing their own stories of injustice. Gregory began to see that his fight was not just for him. It was for everyone who had ever felt wronged, overlooked, or unheard. But even as the town started to come together, Gregory knew that the battle was far from over. The officer's actions had sparked a conversation, but now he had to make sure that the conversation led to real change. He wasn't naive. He knew that not everyone would agree with his decisions, and some would continue to resist. But that didn't matter. He had made a commitment to his town, and he was determined to follow through on it. Gregory spent the next few weeks meeting with community leaders, activists, and citizens from all walks of life. He listened to their concerns, their frustrations, and their hopes for the future. It was clear that the town was at a crossroads, but Gregory was more convinced than ever that they could move forward together. The people were ready for change. and now it was his job to make sure that change was not just a promise but a reality. One afternoon, as he sat in his office reviewing documents for an upcoming town hall meeting, his phone rang. It was Carla. "Hey, Gregory, I just wanted to tell you something," she said, her voice excited. "I heard from a friend of mine. Apparently those officers who messed with you, well, they're being put under review, and there's a chance they might be fired." Gregory felt a rush of relief and satisfaction. This was the moment he had been working for, the moment when the system was finally starting to recognize the importance of accountability. "That's great news," Gregory said, a smile spreading across his face. "It's the right thing to do." Carla paused for a moment. "But I think there's something even bigger happening, Gregory. People are starting to talk about police reform. People are starting to see that this is bigger than just those two officers. They're talking about how we can make real, lasting changes, not just in the police department, but in the entire system." Gregory leaned back in his chair, thinking about everything that had happened. The struggles, the setbacks, the challenges. He had come a long way from that day on the side of the road, when everything seemed to be falling apart. Now he was standing at the beginning of something bigger than he had ever imagined, a movement that could change the course of his town's history. He took a deep breath. This was just the beginning.